This is a very, very dangerous area to be cavalier about. Deploying troops in American cities over the objections of local leaders when there is no actual factual predicate.
He's basically saying you're going to see soldiers outside your polling places. That's going to intimidate a lot of people. And it's going to intimidate people who are not Republicans. Do you actually believe that that's a realistic scenario as to where we could be in 2026? Chicago and Portland are both going to be addressing in court the legality of the National Guard. There is a district judge in Chicago who actually declined to immediately block the National Guard during a hearing on Monday, but has set a hearing for tomorrow to determine if there should be a temporary restraining order. And the appellate court in a different area of the country, in the Ninth Circuit, is going to be hearing arguments also tomorrow on the DOJ's appeal of an Oregon judge who ruled that they could not send in the Oregon or California National Guard into Portland. So, Ankush, take us through the landscape, the legal landscape of where we are with those cases.
Yeah, well, so as you mentioned, the Portland case is further ahead. There had been some pending litigation, and when the troop deployment became imminent, then the lawyers in Oregon brought a very quick motion for a restraining order, TRO. I think the advantage that they had, it seems, or at least that the judge took advantage of, was a more robust factual record. If you read the judge's opinion out of Portland, the district court opinion, it's a very well-constructed, fact-intensive analysis based on declarations that were received and the like. The case in Chicago is behind as a litigating matter, as you just mentioned. The judge declined to grant a initial TRO and has sort of held it in abeyance, considering whether to block it. I am thinking one hypothesis I have, though I think I'm reasonably well informed, is that the judge in Chicago wants to make sure that they have a firmer record, a more robust factual record, because as you may recall, the very first time this was litigated, it was litigated in LA before Judge Breyer on the National Guard deployment to quell protests there. Breyer issued a ruling blocking that. It eventually got reversed by the Ninth Circuit. His preliminary ruling, his very, very first ruling, got blocked by the Ninth Circuit on the theory that he hadn't shown enough deference effectively to the president's determination. And a sense I got out of that was that for every judge involved, it would be better to have a little bit more evidence as factual support, because I think maybe that is where I think Breyer, and then when Breyer came back and issued a more post-trial ruling, it was replete with evidence and citations and testimony and the like. So,
and where does that one stand? Where does the one where the judge came back and offered more specifics? Is that still
the post-trial ruling? I assume the DOJ is appealing, but I honestly don't know at the moment. Do they have time, right? I don't know if they've issued
So let me ask you this. So there's a quote in, actually, this was from Politico, where you work. This is quoting Will Chamberlain, senior counsel at the Article 3 project. And he said, to be frank, if somebody wants 20-1 odds that this temporary restraining order obtained by Oregon leaders would survive Supreme Court review, I'd give it to them. I think it's going to be much closer in the Supreme Court than that, but maybe you disagree based on the makeup of the court.
No, I think it'll be close. I mean, I do think that the Trump Justice Department and the sort of satellite organizations like Article 3 Project and Will Chamberlain, they project an incredible amount of confidence in the Supreme Court. Even as they were racking up these losses in the lower courts on all of this sort of the government firings and the like, the Doge stuff in the first few months, Pam Bondi would constantly, well, the Supreme Court's going to come back, they're going to back us up. And largely, at least in the interim rulings, and we're going to get to like more serious merits rulings in the year ahead, they have been right about that. So it should be closer, though, because I would hope these justices are taking some note of the fact that they have effectively let Trump be sort of unleashed, if you will, as a result of the immunity ruling last year and all of the rulings this year. And this is a very, very dangerous area to be cavalier about. Deploying troops in American cities over the objections of local leaders when there is no actual factual predicate. So I hope it is close.
Talking to Ankush Kadori, who is a former federal prosecutor, also now a senior writer at Politico magazine, Politico. And so it sounds like you think the Supreme Court will likely side with the administration if you were gaming this out. Put aside the 20 to 1 odds this guy's asking for. But
I mean, I would do 50-50. I mean, here's the problem I always have with this court is, if the right analysis should leave them to rule against the administration, even on their own originalist and textual grounds. But then we all just have to recall the Trump immunity decision from last summer, right? We had 6 Republican appointees, all of whom claimed to be textualists and originalists, grant Trump immunity using a theory that had no basis in the text of the Constitution, the history of the drafting of the Constitution, or the framers' expectations when they wrote the Constitution. So I always just have to keep that in mind and sort of remind myself that, like, they will toss aside their purported methodological commitments if the right set of political circumstances confront them. So I'm always very wary with this court. It's a very sad reflection of the state of our jurisprudence and courts, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have slightly more faith in the court, although I think that, some of the rulings I have disagreed with. I think that, I am hopeful that they will try to view this through a more legal prism rather than political. But the governor of Illinois has expressed bigger concerns about what he fears will happen. He's basically saying that, quote, you're going to see soldiers outside your polling places. That's going to intimidate a lot of people. And it's going to intimidate people who are not Republicans. Do you actually believe that that's a realistic scenario as to where we could be in 2026?
I have a hard time envisioning it, right? At the same time, we do have to be realistic about the way this administration it keeps pushing boundaries. And the fact that the Republicans in Congress are not proving to be a check on him. Even in the last 48 hours, with the kind of rhetoric that's been coming out from Stephen Miller and President Trump, even the tweets the social media posts you just mentioned about arresting politicians in Chicago, this is very inflammatory, and they keep pushing it rather than pulling back. So my hope, though, is that there will be enough of a pushback publicly that they will eventually dial down, because this has been unpopular. Both the deployments in LA and the deployment even in DC. It was less unpopular, but it was unpopular according to public polling.
Final question for Ankush before we go to your calls at 866-967-6887. So with regard to what's happening with the National Guard, the president is basically saying or suggesting if he loses, meaning if the courts do come back and say, well, you're not permitted to force a state to accept the National Guard as federalized if you don't want it. He's talking about invoking the Insurrection Act. Now, that does give him, as a legal matter, broader power, no?
Yes, you're right. It has less sort of concrete standards and procedural safeguards. Yeah.
And so what do you make of that? Meaning, so let's assume that they lose or whatever, and then Trump then invokes the Insurrection Act. What happens then, and what do you think the result ends up being?
Look, I assume another round of legal challenges, but I think that would be harder for the challengers to win just because of the legal standard and the deference that statute provides. At that point, look, we are in a land where the checks then become more political than legal, right? And it would be up to people in Congress, including Republicans, to say to Trump, you can't do this, and potentially even, like, I don't know if this will happen with this Congress, but in another administration, an act that aggressive and boundary pushing would be met with serious complaints from even the co-partisans who would say you might be impeached if you do this, because this really would be too far. Now, that doesn't seem like it's in the cards for this Congress, but those are the sort of checks that we would be left to sort of rely upon in a scenario like that, I think.
So you're saying that the only real protection if Trump invokes the Insurrection Act would be Congress and the threat of impeachment?
And the 2026 midterms, right? And whatever skin in the game members in Congress feel by sort of attaching themselves to the presidency in that project, because the litigation will go how it goes, but if it gets resolved against, if we're in that scenario we're talking about against the challengers, then we're left with a set of different checks.
But to be clear, it sounds like on that one, you think the challengers would likely lose a challenge, right?
I think they'd probably lose. I think they'd probably lose.